still, and we didn't go into why. It's just an interesting case where a very rich country suddenly found that the growth stalled. And I've got the BBC's Celia Hatton with us now, who lived in Japan for some years.
Yes, I worked there on and off starting in 2003.
OK, so you caught some of this period of no growth. What was it like?
Well, I've got to say, when I first got to Japan in 2003, honestly, my first reaction was, where are the robots? I mean, I really had it in my head that Japan was this incredibly advanced, high-tech place, and I was really stunned because the architecture looked like it had been stopped in time. It really looked like nothing had been built since the 1980s. And really, lots of bits of daily life in Japan were consumed with bureaucracy. Many times in the day, I'd have to fill out small pieces of paper just to do the most menial things, like buy things in a shop. And it really seemed like many parts of the country were really stuck in time.
But did you find that there was dissatisfaction at the fact that the economy wasn't growing, so people weren't getting richer?
No, I didn't actually. I must say, I think one interesting thing about Japan is that luxury spending and saving continued throughout this period of stagnation, or for most of it, I should say. So even when I first arrived, it seemed that people were relatively content. One interesting thing is that, as I said, luxury spending continued for about the first decade of stagnation. It was still considered normal to have a Louis Vuitton handbag. Sales didn't decline for quite some time. And the savings rate, similarly, the average savings rate in Japan stayed at 20% throughout that period of stagnation. So people didn't seem to adjust too much to the change in the economy.
So are you, because it has been argued, and there is research out there that sort of says when you get to a certain level of wealth, extra wealth doesn't make you much happier. Are you saying that that's what you saw in Japan?
That is what I experienced. And there are many people who argue, actually, that the idea of Japan's lost decades is actually a myth, really tied to demographics. So, of course, there was a collapse in this bubble economy that started in the 1990s. But a lot of Japan's economic problems were related to a decline in the working age population. So it would have experienced this kind of stagnation anyway. If you actually look at the size of the working age population, the amount of economic growth that they produced was actually on par with other Western countries.
Now, Celia, Daniel has written a book saying Ferraris for all makes you happier. So what are you going to say to Daniel?
Well, look, I'm not arguing that Japan didn't suffer during this period. I mean, there is the phenomenon of hikikomori. That's the lost generation of social hermits who really kind of fell off the grid of Japanese society during this time. These are people, generally young adults, who would live at home and would refuse to leave their homes, even their rooms, for years at a time. And in 2010, the government estimated that there were around 700,000 people who fit into this category. So, of course, there is an entire group of people who really were sort of let down by the entire system. Japan's education system is really geared towards graduates finding jobs. Now, when jobs dried up during that period, it really was difficult.
That's a devastating indictment.
Exactly. It really is devastating. So I don't want to paint the picture that people didn't suffer at all. That's not true at all. But I do think, though, that because the savings rate was relatively high before this period hit, and because many Japanese people are used to living in relatively small homes compared to other Western countries, the United States, for example, I think it was a little bit easier for them to adjust to a period of economic stagnation.
OK. Daniel, hold on to the thought of Celia's sort of comments on Japan, because I'm just going to go to Tim and Annie now and just put the sort of flip case to them. Let's start with you, Tim Jackson. In China, they've had this rapid growth, which no doubt has caused great environmental damage. It may have caused great inequality. We'll talk about those two things in the second half of the programme. But it has created a situation in which the Chinese people no longer need to fear famine, which within the lifetimes of many Chinese was something that they experienced, some people. So in that case, even at great environmental cost, Tim Jackson, the growth was justified.
Well, the growth of the incomes in poor people, I think is justified. And the evidence is very, very clear on that as you bring people out of poverty, you can double their life expectancy with a very, very low increase in their income. And likewise, you can reduce infant mortality, you can increase participation in education, you can measure their happiness. And you find the same thing, that as you go from zero to around about $15,000 per capita, your happiness measure doubles, and that's really remarkable. It does say, and this is where I would have to agree with Daniel, it does actually point to the need for economic growth in the poorest parts of the world. So there's a kind of almost moral argument, if you like, to make room for growth where growth matters most. But you're absolutely right to point to the evidence that after a certain time that effect begins to diminish. There are diminishing returns to growth, and in the richest economies actually there's not much increase in happiness, not much increase in life expectancy, no greater participation in education, even though year on year we go on chasing these growth targets. And there has to be a point, particularly on a finite planet, where you begin to ask the question, where should we distribute this growth? Should it be in the poorest parts of the planet, or should it be in the richest? And I think, my answer to that is very, very clear. The poorest parts of the world do need income growth. The richest actually have to find a different development model that doesn't trash the economy, undermine financial stability, and increase inequality.
Annie, why don't I just come to you and just say, do you agree with that number of 15,000? Is that where the diminishing returns, $15,000 per capita income, is where after that you start getting diminishing returns?
So academics disagree about exactly the point.
What range do they have?
So you start diminishing returns relatively low, so 15,000 sounds good. There are some academics who argue that there are points at which the benefit of having more income levels out completely, so that more income on an individual level has absolutely no impact on well-being. That's a bit more controversial.
How much is that?
So one American study put it at about $60,000.
After that, any more money doesn't make you happier.
Says one study, but nobody disagrees, I think, that the improvements are relative to where you are. And that's totally intuitive, right? So if you're a single mum working a couple of jobs, you see a £20 note on the floor, that could make the difference between being able to buy your child a birthday present or not. If you're a millionaire, you might not even bother to lean down and pick it up. So there's a crucial thing here about efficiency, really. How do we want to use the economic benefits that we have, and who's going to get the most benefit out of it?
Would you take a pay rise?
Would I take a pay rise?
You got offered one.
I don't know if I should be saying this on the radio, but I have been offered a pay rise in a situation in which other people were not being paid adequately and refused it.
You're listening to the NewsHour Extra podcast, this week looking at economic growth and whether it is quite as desirable as many of the politicians assume. We're looking at the costs of economic growth as well as the benefits. And there are other podcasts available from the BBC World Service. If I could recommend in particular Witness, which is our historical podcast. It gets people from history giving their accounts of key events that shaped their lives and indeed society more generally. So that's the Witness podcast. But this is BBC NewsHour Extra, and we'll go back to our discussion now. A reminder of our panel: Tim Jackson at the University of Surrey, Jared Bernstein, who was with the President Obama economic team, Annie Quick from the New Economics Foundation, and Daniel Ben-Ami, who's written a book saying everyone should have a Ferrari, or something like that, Daniel. So you've heard these various criticisms of growth, either in high income, people who've got a lot of money, and various other reservations. What's your comeback?
Well, I think rather than us being experts trying to impose our frameworks on ordinary people, let's think about the situation of people in different countries. We're all agreed, or at least on the face of it, that people in the poorer world, which is still billions of people, should have higher incomes. But even if you look at the richer world, you look at the US, for example, and Jared will have more precise figures than me on this, but I think I'm right in saying that if you look at income per hour among a lot of Americans, it's been stagnant for perhaps 20, 30, 40 years. You have a lot of Americans working 2, 3, 4 jobs. If you switch over to Europe, you have many countries like Italy, Spain, France, where you have very high levels of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. You have problems in Britain too. So lots of people, even in the developed world, let alone in the poorer countries, really struggling to get by. And I think really what's being said in relation to happiness, and I don't argue that, in fact, that Ferraris will make you happy. What I argue something very different, which is that The people who focus on happiness are really saying people should be happy with what they've got. Again, it's a very conservative argument that is dressed up as a humane one, saying limit your desires, rein yourself in, restrain yourself. I think it's an argument that anyone who really believes that people should be able to have and earn what they need should really resist.
Jared Bernstein, let me pick up on his first point there, Daniel's first point, and I'll just give you a little anecdote from the British campaign, the Brexit and the leaving the European Union campaign, the referendum here. And one of the people who wanted to stay in was saying, this, if you want higher GDP, higher economic growth, you've got to stay in. And a woman in the audience yelled out, "That's your bloody GDP, not mine." In other words, I'm not getting any benefit from these GDP growth that's generated by Europe. And that must have been a reality for you in the White House.
It remains one. To this day, journalists and others often ask me, Jared, how's the economy doing? And my first response is, well, whose economy are you talking about? I'm very sympathetic with the woman in the audience you mentioned. And in fact, I would argue that she, as a representative of a much larger class of workers, is driving politics in a way that politicians on both sides of the pond are still grappling with. So in this part of the conversation, we've kind of maybe moved to this idea that while you can talk about growth as an aggregate and argue about whether it's good or bad, the issue of distribution always looms large. So in our country, GDP is growing about 2% per year. In your country, maybe half of that right now. And so we can argue that rich people or even middle class people here don't need, a lot more income. And I'm certainly sympathetic to that relative to the arguments that Tim was making, which are very good points. But at the same time, as long as we're generating a 2% growth, which, by the way, is about $400 billion a year in our country, I think people in the middle class have a very good right to ask, well, why should our incomes be stagnant, as Daniel suggested, decade upon decade, when growth, albeit slow, is occurring? And that distributional question is an extremely germane and important one if you want to understand not just American politics, but politics in many advanced economies now.
Can you give me an example from your time in the White House when you tried to advance arguments about the distribution of the proceeds of growth? How did that go?
Well, it was often a real challenge because there were always people on the other side of the argument who wanted to maintain the status quo. So, for example, I remember trying to promote infrastructure programs that would disproportionately benefit blue-collar people, and there were members of our Senate who quite successfully blocked those programs because they didn't want to see government revenues going to job creation for middle and low-income people when their ultimate goal was to cut those taxes and return them to the donor class, which, by the way, happens to be a very robust debate we're having right now in the context of a proposal to cut taxes by the Trump administration.
And can you just give us some information about lobbying and whether the people at the top of the system can get to people like you when you're in power and grasp the proceeds of growth?
I'll give you an example. Tim mentioned earlier the problem of financial markets blowing up economies with their volatility and their systematic underpricing of risk. Well, of course, that was what was behind the housing bubble and the Great Recession. So the Obama administration was pretty aggressively trying to come up with financial market regulations to restrain that bubble bust scenario. And at one point I went out on TV and I was talking about this, as we do in the White House. I was talking about our policies and how we were going to try to restrain bank credit card practices that were clearly exploiting consumers. I get back to my office, the phone rings, I pick it up. It's Jamie Dimon, who is the president of one of our largest banks here, who somehow had my phone number within the White House and chewed me out for about 15 minutes. And I was struck by two things. One, this very busy person pays attention to everything. And two, he had